But the United States blew it off because the U.S. the leaders are stupid. They're arrogant. They don't know what they're doing. They think they can do whatever they want.
While the American leaders may be arrogant, the European leaders are obviously spineless.
This is a European leader who wouldn't dream of saying this publicly right now. You know what? A bunch of idiots.
You make it sound like that in the upper echelons or the elite political circles, that there's a bunch of arrogant, not qualified individuals that are making decisions that are consequential for millions and millions of people on this planet.
The only thing I disagree with you is it's about billions of people.
I personally have more distrust in these global institutions than maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
I think your distrust is completely misplaced. You're missing the point.
Okay, it might be.
Where is the power?
Hello everyone, my name is Jasmin Kosubek and I speak to interesting people every week. And this week I have a real gem here in Germany, which is why I'm speaking English to everyone out there. Usually I speak German, but this is a little different because my guest is here from the United States, visiting Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. Let me introduce you. I mean, there's so much to say about you, so I just kind of summarize it in a little bit. You're one of the most influential economists of our time, at least named twice by Time magazine. You're a global leader and celebrated for your work in sustainable development. And you're also no stranger to controversy, often challenging conventional narratives. So first, maybe we'll start with what brings you to Germany. And I have this book that you have just published in the Westend Verlag, a publisher that I really enjoy working with. It's called Diplomacy or Desaster, to German Diplomatie oder Desaster. Zeitenwende in den USA, ist Frieden möglich? Zeitenwende, how would you translate that? Times changing in the USA, is peace possible? You know, it's interesting. I spoke to John Mearsheimer a couple of months ago and the thumbnail was, is peace possible? Mm-hmm. You're also friends with John Mearsheimer, not just friends, but also intellectually, you're close. But maybe aside from promoting your book, what brings you to Germany?
I'm very happy to be here because this is a pivotal moment for the U.S. with a new president, Germany with an upcoming election, a new European Commission, lots happening in the world. And so I'm having good discussions here in Germany about the politics and about the prospects. So for me, it's extremely timely to be here, and I'm grateful for the chance to talk about the book as well, which is about, after all, ending the Ukraine war, moving to diplomacy, having a very different kind of politics from the kind of politics that we've had for the past few years, which I think has been a failure of politics.
You're calling it a pivotal moment, and I think a lot of people would agree, is at least what happened in the United States with Trump. He just started his presidency. And you're saying it's the same for Germany with the new elections. Now, could you maybe explain that a little further? What role Germany plays, in your opinion, in the current conflict concerning Ukraine?
Well, Germany has been completely aligned with the United States. It's been a kind of bulwark of the U.S.-led policy. The Biden administration was carrying out what I think is fair to say the long-term, and I would say deep state policy of the United States, which was to expand NATO eastward, antagonize Russia, try to surround Russia, strategically weaken Russia. And Chancellor Scholz was absolutely a part of that, supporting it at every step. And I think it has gotten us into a big mess, frankly.
Do you think an independent German foreign policy is even possible?
Of course it's possible. Germany has had an independent foreign policy in the past. Willy Brandt and Ostpolitik was not a U.S. initiative. It was a German initiative. In 2003, when the U.S. stupidly went to war in Iraq, the German government, the chancellor, was outspoken. No, that's a bad idea. There have been many occasions where Germany has had its foreign policy at odds with the United States. And what brings us to the current crisis, the war in Ukraine, you can date to 2008 in a sense. That was when NATO said, we will expand to Ukraine and to Georgia, that was a decision pushed by the United States against the better judgment of European leaders who knew this is reckless, this is provocative, why stir up things in Europe? But the U.S. pushed it. And something decisive happened. Actually, Chancellor Merkel has described it in her memoirs, in her recent book. She describes how at the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, she and Sarkozy said to George Bush Jr., this is a bad idea. We don't want to provoke Russia. We don't need to commit to expanding NATO. And the U.S. was dead set on doing it for basically deep state reasons, which is the U.S. is the U.S. We'll do what we want. We can do what we want. What can Russia do to stop us? After all, we are the most powerful country in the world. That's the mindset.
But is that also the reason? Do you think there's no other reasoning behind it? Maybe, I don't know, resources in Ukraine, security reasons, obviously, because they want to expand NATO. So is it just this idea we're a superpower and that's why we're just going to do what we're going to do?
I think that's the overwhelming reason. I don't think you get huge economic returns out of this and so forth. It's actually been very costly. But the point I wanted to make is that Chancellor Merkel knew this is a bad idea, and she resisted and resisted, but the U.S. said, no, we're going to do it. And then she gave in. She gave in the decision of NATO to announce that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. That's the conclusion of the Bucharest summit. It's sad that she gave in. She knew it was a bad idea. She protested against it. But in the end, she didn't resist the U.S. pressure. I think that was really, unfortunately, a historic bad mistake, because if she had stood up to the U.S. pressure, the right outcome would have been achieved. No such declaration, and we would not have gone on to war. Of course, the war started 6 years afterwards in 2014 with the violent coup against Yanukovych, but all of that was part of a long-term U.S.-led process, and had Germany, especially Germany and France and Italy and other major countries of Europe resisted, we would not be where we are today. We would be in a much safer place. There would not be a war in Ukraine. Ukraine would not have lost a million people to death and grievous injury. So we would have been much better off. But the U.S. got its way, and we are where we are because of that.
What do you think is the difference from 2008, the Bucharest summit, to 2003, where the German government did resist in joining the war in Iraq? I mean, it's only 5 years if you really think about it.
No fundamental difference. I think it was a mistake, actually. Now, this is high stakes. People in these positions are consequential. They make decisions that have consequences. And I don't believe that it was the case that Chancellor Merkel had no choice, that it's inevitable, that the United States had to have its way. I don't believe that. I think these are decisions that are taken. This one was a bad decision. I believe, by the way, that even as late as 2021, before the escalation with the Russian invasion in February 2022, that invasion could have been avoided. And the reasoning is that Putin put on the table some very specific proposals to avoid that invasion, and the United States refused to negotiate over them. Once again, if at that stage the German government, together with the French government, together with Italy, maybe together with Spain, had said, look, we're at the core of this. NATO is not the United States. NATO is an alliance. We happen to live right here near Russia. We need a different approach rather than simply provocation. Even then, things could have changed. Of course, things had advanced a long way. Chancellor Merkel had made another mistake. And it's sad for me to say it, by the way, because I really admired her in many, many ways. I thought she was very serious, very consequent, very responsible, not a flighty person, but a very level-headed, very intelligent person and a very well-directed person. But she made another mistake, which was that Germany was the guarantor of the Minsk II agreement. The Minsk II agreement was an agreement reached in February 2015, a year after the coup, to stop the escalating violence. And it could have done so. It was an agreement in which the breakaway parts of Ukraine, the Donbas region, Donetsk and Lugansk, would have received political autonomy. Well, it was voted by the UN Security Council. Germany and France were to be the guarantors of this UN-backed treaty. And the US and Ukraine blew it off, saying, we don't like it. It was with a gun to our head. We're not going to accept it. And unfortunately, the guarantors of the agreement, Germany and France, went along again with the US. And recently, of course, Chancellor Merkel, in a pretty infamous interview, said, well, it wasn't really an agreement. It was just to buy time. By the way, I don't believe that was her motive back in 2015. I think she really meant it.
That's interesting, because I was going to say, this is the last information I have about Minsk, that it was just implemented, or it wasn't implemented, but they discussed it, negotiated it just to buy time. But you say that back then when they did negotiate it, that you did take it seriously, or that they took it seriously, and then later she kind of backtracked on
exactly.
that.
I think later on, when it became so unpopular to have any kind of compromise with Putin, she backtracked and said, oh, no, it was a little bit of a trick. It wasn't real. But the fact of the matter is, it was a good agreement, and it was a real agreement, and I believe she believed in it. And I have reason to know that, actually, in a kind of surprising way, which is that in major ways, the Minsk II agreement was modeled on the autonomy of the German-speaking Alpine region of Italy, Bolzano and South Tyrol.
Yeah, Südtirol.
Now, this is a German minority region which demanded autonomy after World War II. And at first there was a kind of pseudo-autonomy, but then there was protests and unrest, and then a real autonomy. Now it's a booming, happy region. Italy's very happy with it. Everybody likes the arrangements.
Beautiful region.
And what's interesting is that this was very much on Chancellor Merkel's mind, I'm told by people who know, as the model for what should happen in the Donbas. So I think she really believed in this approach. I believe in it. I don't think it was a bad agreement. It was a smart agreement. It would have ended the war. But the United States blew it off because the U.S. the leaders are stupid. They're arrogant. They don't know what they're doing. They think they can do whatever they want. And so they didn't take it seriously, even though it was a UN Security Council, even though President Putin was also a big part of it, even though there was a Normandy process. It was serious, but not to the arrogant Americans. But what's unfortunate is Chancellor Merkel didn't stand up and say, we are the guarantors of this. You, Ukraine, must take it seriously. Germany went silent. France went silent. And so, in a sense, what we've seen since 2008, in my interpretation, is that the major European countries just bent to the U.S. will. I don't really know why that is. Honest to goodness, I don't know why that is.
You make it sound very human from what you're saying. Like you're saying American leaders, they're just stupid, like they're arrogant. So this is a very human characteristic to have.
Yes.
And then when you talk about like mistakes that were made, just like Iraq or like Ukraine, or not adhering to Minsk and not saying, yes, we're the guarantors of Minsk, so we're going to pull through. it just makes it sound very human that these were just human errors, human mistakes that are, like you said, very consequential, because we're talking about people who are elite politicians. And when they make a decision, it affects millions of people.
That's exactly right. And I should clarify that when it comes to the U.S., these are decisions that were taken decades ago in a sense, because it's not ad hoc decisions. Back in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union ended, the CIA, the Pentagon, the security state apparatus of the U.S. said, okay, now we're the sole superpower. Now we're in charge. Russia's weak. We can do what we want. That was the mindset. And the decision was taken, we know now, by historians, by people who participated already back in 1994, that the U.S. would lead NATO eastward, contravening the solemn promises that were made in 1990 in Germany as part of German reunification on February 9th, 1990, when James Baker III, our Secretary of State, said to President Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO will move not 1 inch eastward. But the United States, deep state, said, we don't have to abide by that. They're not even here anymore. So Clinton, already in 1994, started the eastward process by internal agreement. The first actual policies were revealed in the second half of the 1990s, but the decisions were taken in 1994. So I don't want to say that it's ad hoc decisions by the U.S. It's consistently stupid decisions based on a strategy that was an arrogant, hubristic strategy. But what I do say is that Germany could have stopped it, because it wasn't just German opposition. Europeans knew all along, this is a bad idea, this is provocative, why stir up the big bear to our east? This is a big country, things are quiet and fine, why stir things up? And they tried to explain that to the United States, in my interpretation, but the U.S. doesn't listen. So at that point, German leaders had a decision: make the U.S. listen, say, no, we're not going to have a conclusion of the Bucharest summit, in which case the U.S., in my view, would have had to back down, or consent, but then with huge consequences. I can tell you another European leader who is around today as a leader was involved in 2008 and said to me afterwards, personally, again, what is your president doing? This is so reckless. This is so irresponsible. They promised us, this person explained to me, that they wouldn't do this. And then Bush went off on Christmas vacation and they came back and they announced we're expanding NATO. Okay, this is a European leader who wouldn't dream of saying this publicly right now. But I not only heard it with my own ears, this is somebody I'm friendly with. And it's extremely annoying and disappointing, actually, because these are not high school games. This is not a board game. This is not a poker game. This is real life with hundreds of thousands of people dying because of these decisions. Europe knew it. The United States is stupid. I'm going to say it again. I mean the leaders who are basically arrogant is the right point. Stupid means they're so arrogant they can't see through their own arrogance. They think they call the shots. And the European leaders let them do it for at least the last 16 years since 2008.
While the American leaders may be arrogant, the European leaders are obviously spineless, I would
Completely.
say. So I think that one kind of feeds into the other, because one wouldn't happen without the other. Now, I have so many questions to ask because you mentioned so many things. You mentioned the 90s in Russia, where you also advised Boris Yeltsin, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and Gorbachev.
And Gorbachev. Do you think that, well, back then, now this is my interpretation, you may contradict as we go along. As far as I'm concerned, you were also known as somewhat of an economic magician or a shock therapist back then. So you introduced some very, depends on who looks at it, radical economic reforms that were in my opinion, probably necessary in certain countries. Do you think that these, some would probably call them neoliberal reforms, kind of paved the way for NATO expansion?
No, not at all. First of all, everything that is said about this is simple-minded. I was and am good at financial stabilization of a country that is financially destabilized. That's my expertise, that's my experience, and I've done it many times successfully. One of the core lessons of economic stabilization is it sure helps to have some support in a timely way from outside.
What does that mean?
It means that if a country is in a hyperinflation or can't pay its debts, that someone on the outside, a foreign government or foreign agencies, give loans to help stabilize the situation, not to make things worse. And I learned this, the basics of the trade, in part through the experience of Germany after World War I, because probably the most famous book about economic crises ever written was John Maynard Keynes' book about the Treaty of Versailles, written in 1919, called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And he was protesting the harsh settlement of the Versailles Treaty, which put all the blame on Germany, put all the reparations on Germany, and so forth. And Keynes said, this is not good. This is not the right way to settle a war. War should be settled with magnanimity and with some economic sense. Don't put the reparations on so heavily. This will lead to political backlash. This will lead to unrest. Okay, I studied this. I thought about this. I helped end hyperinflations in Latin America. I helped negotiate debt relief in Latin America and then in Poland. And in Poland in 1989, it was an extremely financially unstable country that had defaulted many years earlier, martial law, all the history of the 1980s. And then suddenly it became a democratic post-communist country, even before the fall of the Berlin Wall. The first elections in Eastern Europe that were really contested after World War II occurred in Poland on June 4th, 1989. I became, for a number of reasons, both because of my substantive knowledge and just being there and the oddity of experience, I became their main advisor. So I watched the transformation very close up, and I helped to call some of the main policy shots, including debt cancellation, emergency loans, something that I invented called the Zloty Stabilization Fund to help stabilize the currency. I mention all of this because that's what I do. So it wasn't that I'm a neoliberal. I'm, by the way, philosophically a social democrat and always have been. I like a mixed economy. I want government to take care of people, health care and so forth. That's been my philosophy my whole life.
I think the reason people criticize certain policies is because they came at a cost. So if we're talking about certain,
but look, like the reason they criticize, people don't understand an economic crisis, period. I'm sorry to say.
That might very well be true.
They just don't.
Yeah.
So let me just finish what I was saying. I had to come to Bonn, actually, then to explain Germany has to help Poland. And there were officials here, well, they owe their debt, you know. I said, no, they don't just owe their debt. You have to forgive their debt. And I had to explain here, by the way, that in 1953, the Nazi-era debt was forgiven by the Western countries to give the Federal Republic of Germany a fresh start. I said, you have to do the same with Poland. They said, oh, yes, that's a good point, Mr. Sachs. And Germany agreed. Poland got help, and it stabilized and started growing. It wasn't some evil shock therapy, neoliberal, blah, blah, blah. No, just to explain, let me finish. It was sensible economic stabilization. Now, I was asked then by Gorbachev, by his economic team, help us do the same thing. I said, absolutely. The West helped Poland. Now the West will help you. And I was part of a project at Harvard in 1991 in the spring called The Grand Bargain, which was to lay out the West could give major loans and financing for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would democratize and in an orderly way make a transformation to a market economy and democratic system. You know what the White House said? No, period. They didn't say, oh, interesting ideas. Well, maybe we could do this. Maybe we could do that. They said, no. I've recently read the National Security Council minutes of the meeting where they said no. I had never seen that. Somebody sent them to me from the historical archives just recently. You know what? A bunch of idiots. One of them, somebody I knew and never liked, said, we have to do the minimum possible without them collapsing, but the minimum possible. There's a word for that I can't use in polite company. That is really, really stupid. Then, when Gorbachev just had nothing and the situation was collapsing, he went home to a putsch in the summer of 1991. Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank in Moscow and said, I'm the leader of Russia and I will lead us out of this mess. And in the next month, in September 1991, Boris Yeltsin's advisor, Yegor Gaidar, called me, said, we want your help because we need help. We've got debts that we can't pay. We're out of foreign exchange reserves. There's nothing in the shops. The black market prices are soaring and so forth. And I went to the dacha of the Russian government. By the way, the dacha was in such bad shape. Nothing worked. Everything had fallen apart in this place. And in December 1991, I sat here, and where you are sitting right across from me was Boris Yeltsin. He came into the room. He sat in front of me. I had colleagues on the side. I was the lead of the delegation. I was kind of a young person at the time. And he said, I want to tell you the Soviet Union is over. We were there at the moment that he had negotiated the end of the Soviet Union. And then he said in a very lucid way, we want freedom, we want to be normal, we want to be democratic, we want to be a market economy. Then it was my time to speak. And I said, Mr. President, this is one of the most important moments of modern history. It's such an honor to be here. And I'm sure that the Western world will help you to accomplish this, because this is for peace, this is for our future, and what you are doing is something we need to support. I have no doubt, Mr. President, the Western world will support you. Well, how wrong I was about that. Not about my economic advice, which was completely rejected by Washington, because they didn't want to do anything. That's what this is all about. And so I got the glimpse. By the way, I really didn't understand it because I couldn't imagine how foolish my compatriots were until years afterwards. And then now I know there's almost no limit to how stupid they can be. But that's what this story is about.
You make it sound like that in the upper echelons or the elite political circles, that there's a bunch of arrogant, not qualified individuals that are making decisions that are consequential for millions and millions of people on this planet.
The only thing I disagree with you is it's about billions of people.
Excuse me, you're right. It's about billions of people. So this brings me to a question that I thought about. So we'll ease into this topic. So you've advised 3 UN Secretary-Generals and played a key role in projects like the Millennium Development Goals and Agenda 2030. So how do you think the UN has evolved over the years? And do you think that global initiatives like the Sustainable Development Goals or the Millennium Development Goals have contributed to growing distrust in these global institutions, calling them elitist tools for greenwashing, I don't know, making money, whatever. So how would you respond to that? One, how has the UN evolved? And do you think that these huge institutions, these huge programs, like these sustainable development goals, like these elitist, I would call them, it's my opinion, okay? These elitist projects that are rolled out onto the planet, obviously, like at the head of them, people who are not qualified to make these decisions.
No,
At least that's what it seems like.
This
Okay,
is a
okay.
complete misunderstanding.
Okay, then that's great. But so how do you think that works? So how's the UN changed? And do you think that these institutions have somewhat been responsible for creating distrust in those global institutions?
Okay, what is the UN? The UN is, first of all, a place where its members, which is 193 governments, meet. So it is a place where diplomacy can take place. There are 193 UN member states. There's a UN General Assembly. Every September, about 140 world leaders come to the UN. They meet with each other and they give a speech to the UN General Assembly. And it's extremely important that the world has a venue like that. That's one part of what the UN is. Another part of what the UN is an organization to manage that process. So that's what the Secretary-General does. And it's called the Secretariat of the UN. A third thing the UN is specialized institutions like the World Health Organization or UNESCO or the UN Development Program or the International Telecommunications Union. There are a couple dozen of these organizations that are very important for global standard setting or setting trade rules or setting even technical standards for how the internet works and so forth. There is the UN Security Council, which is composed of 5 permanent members, the US, China, Russia, UK, and France, and 10 temporary members on a rotating basis, voting basis, with 2-year terms, that's supposed to keep the global peace. Now, does this work? Not very well. It doesn't work very well because it is not empowered to work very well. The world is basically with power at the nation-state level. It's a little bit like the European Union. Most of the power, most of the budget, most of the activities are at the level of the member states, not at the level of the Commission, say. But the UN's even much weaker than the EU in this regard because there is no delegation of power from the United States to the UN. So when you say, what has the UN done around sustainable development? Well, the good thing is it helped the 193 governments to establish some purpose and goals and to adopt some shared goals. Then the technical agencies say, well, here's how you could achieve those goals. But is there enforcement of those goals? No. Nobody tells the U.S. what to do, unfortunately. The U.S. doesn't abide by treaties even. It signs treaties, about to walk out of the Paris Climate Agreement.
Also the WHO, right?
And it just walked out of the WHO. So just to say, if we don't get greenhouse gas emissions under control, would you say, oh, that's the UN failure, UN elitism? Or would you say, the United States doesn't do anything? That's what I would say. So you have to just understand, what do we have? What can we work with? The UN also has almost no money. The money comes from what the member states give it. The budget is absolutely tiny, and the U.S. doesn't even pay on time. So if you ask me about the UN, I've devoted the last 25 years of my life trying to help the UN. We need a global institution. We've got global problems. We don't want nuclear proliferation. We do want nuclear arms control. We do want to control the climate crisis. We do want to be able to control epidemic diseases. We want that.
I think when people hear that, they get a little bit scared about the word control and about global institutions rolling out control.
They should be pretty damn scared about what's happening to our climate. They should be pretty damn scared about diseases like AIDS or malaria running out of control and killing millions of poor people. Yeah, they should be scared about that. And that's what we should be working together to try to solve. We've got real problems on this planet.
These problems that you talked about are specific problems in certain areas.
We hit 1.5 degrees Celsius in 2024. Europe, by the way, is one of the most vulnerable places on the whole planet to climate change. If we push the Earth system just a little bit more, we could have a complete collapse of the way the ocean circulation works, and that would throw Europe into the worst climate crisis in its entire history.
The problem with that is that we've been hearing this for decades.
That's true.
Yeah, but nothing has happened so far.
Not very much has happened.
I'm talking about like the crisis scenario that has been described over decades and decades.
Yeah.
Hasn't come to, how do you say, fruition?
Of course are you kidding? It's come to fruition everywhere.
How? Where?
Los Angeles is burning down.
I don't think that was a climate issue.
Oh, well, thank you.
I think it was a wind issue. And I don't think there was I think that there was problems on the grounds. And I wouldn't disagree that we obviously have
I find what you're
climate.
I find what you're saying absurd, by the way, because we see all over the world.
I'm not disagreeing in total.
Excuse me.
You know?
Just let me say, we see all over the world extreme storms, Category 5 hurricanes. We know from the physics, you warm up the Caribbean, you're going to get more Category 5 hurricanes. They're slamming these islands. They are slamming Florida. But that's happening everywhere in the world. I travel all over the world. There are mega droughts. There are mega floods. There are bursts of glacial lakes that are killing people in the high mountain regions. There are mega forest fires all over the world, just as was said, and it's getting worse. So if you say, oh, we've been warned and it's some elite gimmick about being warned, it's sad to hear that, frankly. That's ridiculous. Sorry.
Well, I am sort of voicing opinions that, you know, I've gathered and that I kind of hear, and that's why I want to speak to you about it, because I think this is a great possibility to discuss these issues and the sentiment that I'm getting, I'll just say, by the people, right? And which is why I'm wondering if you've noticed that there is a growing distrust in institutions, and if you think, like, how do you think that came about? Why do you think people aren't, like, let's take me, for example. Why do you think people like me are not taking these scenarios that serious anymore? Because I personally have more distrust in these global institutions than maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Obviously, I was younger then, so maybe there wasn't as much interest. But like, let's take the WHO.
I think I think your distrust is completely misplaced. I would urge you to distrust the U.S. government. It's based on power. It's based on greed. It is a plutocracy. It does very nasty things. If you look at where COVID came from, I'll give you 98%, 99%. It came out of a U.S. laboratory research project, and I know the details of it. It didn't come out of WHO. It came out of University of North Carolina, for God's sake. And they lied about it. So if you want to know where to distrust, distrust centers of power. The UN isn't a center of power. It's a meeting place where centers of power give the finger to the other countries.
But isn't it like that's where, I mean, that's where a center, okay, it's not a center of power like the United States might be.
That's correct.
But it's where different centers of powers meet to create ideas and to implement ideas that do affect billions of people on the entire planet.
Yeah, but I guess you're missing what is happening. What is happening is that treaties are made and goals are being set, and then the U.S. blows them off.
It's not just the U.S., is it? Or would you say that it's just the U.S. that's blowing them off?
Well, there are 196 countries that are signatories to the Paris Climate Agreement, and one of them just walked out.
Okay, yeah.
One.
You're talking about the United States.
I'm talking about the United States. One of them just walked out. There are 190 countries that are members of WHO or thereabouts. One of them just walked out.
The United States. But let's
There-
take the WHO, for example.
No,
you don't think there's any merit to distrusting the WHO?
Let's continue. There is a worldwide sentiment, that there should be a state of Palestine because that is international law. One country vetoed that. Which one is that?
It's going to be the United States.
That would be the United States, indeed, because it has a veto and it used its veto.
And because it has influence from Israel.
Of course. But my point is that if you want to understand what's going on, understand power.
I would just argue that, these institutions also have power. They might have limited power, but the WHO has power. It had ideas. It had ideas. Okay, then I might very well be wrong, but it had ideas about how to curb the pandemic that we saw that in, between 2020 and 2023. And so I would argue that, let's take the WHO, that I do understand why people distrust a global organization that has ideas on how to fight a pandemic, and then the nation states implement these rules, even though they might not even make sense in that particular country.
By the way, they don't. It sad to say, it has no power.
Okay.
Sad to say.
Well, I mean, honestly, I find that it's easing me. It's like, it's kind of relaxing.
No, but it's, but you're missing the point.
Okay, it might be.
Where is the power? The power is with powerful countries. And the most powerful country is the United States. And it does what it wants. And when it doesn't like a treaty, it just walks out of the treaty. Or it doesn't sign the treaty.
But isn't that the right of any sovereign state to, if they don't want to adhere to a treaty, to kind of remove itself from a treaty?
It's a right, and it's a stupidity if we have.
Well, it might be wrong. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying,
I'm telling you, it's wrong.
Okay.
Because the United States is completely irresponsible. So that's the problem. That's what we're after.
So I know that you favor multilateralism, which makes sense. Multilateralism, right? That's what I would call it, at least. So you're an advocate for multilateralism for the future. So how do you think that would look like in a world where we have the United States that's removing itself from all these treaties? Then we have these new power centers that are rising, at least from what I can tell, like China and Russia, just to name two of them. India, a little further back, but it's still there. So how do you think what's that going to look like? I mean, is multilateralism even possible when you have this competition between these nation states that are obviously more powerful than a lot of the other countries that are also represented in the UN?
Why should countries sign treaties? Well, they could say, and in fact, Donald Trump does, I don't want to sign treaties. I want to have my freedom of action. But the reason you sign a treaty is you say, I'd like you to do something. You'd like me to do something. So we agree in a treaty. That's a basic function of living together on the planet. So I'm not very happy that the United States slams the door, walks out, abrogates treaties, refuses to sign treaties. If you ask me, does multipolarity, meaning several places that have power, undermine multilateralism, I would say quite the contrary. Multipolarity makes multilateralism crucial. What does multilateralism mean? It means, or what I would say it should mean, is that powerful countries agree to abide by shared rules. They agree to live under an international rule of law. They don't just say, it's a jungle, we do what we want, we leave when we want, we have the right, because we're sovereign, to do anything we want, but rather to say, we're going to live together, not blow up the planet, address environmental crises, and do other things that we need to do because it's in our mutual benefit. To me, that's what being a grown-up is. You don't say, I don't like law. That's terrible. I want freedom. I want to do what we want. So I don't have to obey anything. I just want to do what I want. I'm a free person. I'm not going to obey any law. You'd say someone like that is a little nuts, and they'd be arrested and so forth. Well, why do we have those laws? Why don't we just let people do what they want? because it doesn't work very well when people just do what they want. But Donald Trump thinks countries should just do what they want. He has the idea we're sovereign, we're free, we do what we want. I don't want international law. We're the United States of America. Well, how good is that? How's that going to work out? Is that going to work out great for the world? I don't think so. So this is the real issue, not the UN. My God, the UN is where the United States says, go to hell. It's not where we get actual decision-making that is enforced. There is no enforcement right now. That's a problem. I want a stronger institution, not the weak one that we have right now, because I actually believe it's okay to have stop signs and street lights, which is an infringement on the freedom to cross the street when you want, because if you don't have those, we end up with a lot of people dead. Well, I want that at the global level too.
What would that look like to you to have enforcement on a global level?
It would mean that when you have a UN Security Council treaty, you take it seriously. It would mean that if in February 17, 2015, when the UN Security Council voted for the Minsk II agreement by unanimous vote, that Chancellor Merkel would say, this is real, this is serious, and we're the guarantor. That's what it would mean. What would the enforcement mean? The enforcement might mean, first of all, that there would be a norm of responsibility. So there would be accountability. We would have every year a systematic process. Are you abiding by the treaty? Are you not abiding by the treaty? Just having an honest process, having an independent scrutiny. We don't even have that because rich countries, especially the United States, does not want anyone looking over its shoulder. It's sovereign. We do what we want. No one's going to tell us what to do. Well, that would be the first thing. By the way, I testified in the UN Security Council a couple of years ago saying we needed an independent investigation of Nord Stream. Nord Stream was blown up. I think the overwhelming evidence is the United States blew it up. It promised to do so, with Chancellor Scholz standing by the side of President Biden when he promised to end it on February 7th, 2022, in a White House press conference. And then it was blown up. And I said, well, why don't we investigate? Oh, the United States said, no way, that's completely inappropriate. Why should we have an investigation? Germany's going to investigate. Denmark's going to investigate. Sweden's going to investigate. I said, well, maybe NATO won't investigate itself very well. Maybe we need an independent UN investigation. Mr. Sachs, you're completely out of line. Well, do you blame the UN that we don't quite know what happened, or would you blame the United States and your German government?
I blame Germany.
Yeah, I would too, because Chancellor Scholz knows what happened.
I think it's embarrassing. Oh, you think he knows?
Of course he knows.
Mm-hmm.
How could he not know? Of course he knows. Everybody knows, by the way. Because President Biden said it, and so did so many other U.S. officials over the years. They said, we don't like this pipeline. We don't want Germany and Russia binding together. We don't
In Germany,
want
they say it's a conspiracy, if you think that way, because they have different theories about it. So.
It is a conspiracy. The United States conspired to blow up the pipeline. That's what a conspiracy is. And then they lied about it. And of course, Chancellor Scholz knows about it. And by the way, if he doesn't know about it, and he was standing there when Joe Biden promised that he would end the pipeline and that, quote, the U.S., we have our ways, I would hope the chancellor would ask the U.S., well, what did happen?
Mm-hmm. Maybe they did in certain backroom talks.
Oh, maybe
do you
in back
think?
rooms,
Do you think
but
so?
I think, yeah, I think they know.
Do you know if people are chatting about Nord Stream, and are they talking about Germany, that it's embarrassing that we aren't even trying to figure out who did it?
Well, I'm talking, I mean,
I'm just trying to get the inside scoop now.
I'll give you the good news and the bad news. Your chancellor knows who did it, but he's not talking. Okay? So that's my view.
Mm-hmm. On Nord Stream.
And my view in general is we should be responsible grown-ups. If something like that happens, maybe the chancellor says, I really don't know. And then I would say to him, don't you think you should find out? That's what I would respond, because that's very serious what happened. That toppled the German economy. So it's worth finding out what happened.
I'd agree. I'd agree with that. It's definitely worth finding. I'm glad we have common ground on that. I definitely agree with that. So let me ask you this: you've voiced strong criticism about the deep state in the United States being arrogant, about certain political elites being, well, making not so smart decisions. I'll put it that way. So that begs the question, to me at least, with these powerful people that are shaping global policy, can normal people like me, can we trust them?
No. No, of course not. We need accountable institutions.
How would we trust them? See, this is the thing. Like, I wonder how to trust them.
I'll explain why.
Please do. Yeah.
The reason we don't have accountability is that we have governments that run on secrecy, like blowing up Nord Stream. And we have governments that run on secrecy because we have built into our laws and our institutions secrecy. This started in the United States, especially in 1947, in the National Security Act. And the biggest culprit of all is the CIA. And the CIA is a secret army. We know that. It topples governments, it destabilizes governments, it assassinates people. We shouldn't have such secrecy. I think it's, by the way, a massively failed institution. I've studied it for more than 40 years. It makes terrible, terrible judgments and terrible, terrible mistakes. But you know what? Doesn't matter. There's no report card. There's no accountability. There's no scorecard. They just deny. We didn't do that. We had nothing to do with that. Us? Why would you say us when it's obvious? Okay, this is the problem. How can we trust when there's no accountability? So we need to clean up our institutions. Doesn't mean that anarchy is the answer. It doesn't mean we don't need government. It doesn't mean we don't need a UN. We need to make these institutions work. So we need to understand what's wrong with them. Why are they dysfunctional? What's happening? How can they be fixed? This year, 2025, is the 50th anniversary of the only time in America that the CIA was scrutinized. That was 1975 in a congressional process in the U.S. Senate called the Church Committee, because Senator Frank Church of Idaho presided. They uncovered crime after crime after crime of the CIA: assassinations, surveillance, by the way, grabbing people out of Times Square, giving them drugs without them knowing it, people committing suicide, jumping out of windows. MK Ultra was the name of that particular program. That was all uncovered the one time the CIA was scrutinized. It was scrutinized because of a weird set of events. We had the Watergate scandal, and so President Nixon had resigned, and President Gerald Ford was not elected by the public, so he was quite weak. He couldn't resist the Senate investigation at the time. And the CIA had changed hands. So there was a moment when we could look under the covers. It was horrifying. That was 50 years ago. There has been no public hearings for 50 years. Now, President Trump just said he's going to release the files on the 2 Kennedy assassinations and the Martin Luther King assassination. Well, if he does this is a breakthrough that we've waited more than 60 years for in the case of the JFK assassination. We need accountability, not the secrecy. If you say, can we trust these institutions? Absolutely not. What's the right response? Understand them. Try to understand what they're doing. You won't find it in the mainstream media, so you better look around. When you're attacked as a conspiracy theorist, you better understand that unaccountable institutions operate by conspiracies. That doesn't mean every conspiracy theory is true, but it doesn't mean that there are no conspiracies. Of course there are. That's what secrecy is, to do things that are secret or deniable, that are otherwise rampantly against the law. That's the business of that organization. I don't like it. I don't think a democratic country should have an organization like that.
So you just mentioned the opening up of the files, releasing the files of the assassinations. That's one thing that he signed by presidential decree. Is that
Yes,
what it's called?
Exactly.
And Trump also promised during his campaign that he would shut down the Ukraine war. He would figure it out within, I don't know, a couple of days.
I think he said an hour, maybe. Or
Yeah,
one day.
something like that. So it's already been an hour.
Yeah.
I don't think it's been figured out yet. So where do you think this is going with Trump as president? I understand that way back when you supported Bernie Sanders, so obviously you're not going to you're not going to support him on domestic policies or international policies, but maybe on those issues. Where do you think the United States is going? What is your assessment?
Well, let me just explain one thing, especially for also German listeners. The guy comes into office at noon on January 20th, 2025, and suddenly spends the day signing orders. One person, no laws, no congressional oversight. He just signs orders. It's a little strange. And some of these are really consequential orders, like withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement or withdrawing from the World Health Organization, choosing whether or not to raise tariffs and so forth. How does he do that? Well, turns out all through U.S. law are emergency clauses. And emergency clauses say, I declare an emergency. I declare an emergency on the southern border. I declare an emergency here. All he has to do is declare an emergency, and then it's one-person rule. Well, this is a big problem with America, period. Whether what he's doing is right or wrong, it's shocking to me to watch one person signing these decrees, one after another, calling something an emergency. Oh, all right. Call me a little naive. We had a revolution in 1776 because we didn't like King George III signing decrees one after another without any say of the American colonies. I don't like a president being able to invoke emergencies as he calls them and then making major decisions as an individual. Okay, that I just want to explain why that's so weird. What will he actually do? You never know with Donald Trump. But he could and should end the war in Ukraine because it's just about the most misguided, stupid venture that America's been in, although it's hard to say because Iraq was a stupid venture, Syria was a stupid venture, Libya was a stupid venture, Afghanistan was a stupid venture, Vietnam was a stupid venture. So there have been a lot of them, but the Ukraine war was, as we discussed, a completely unnecessary, avoidable war. He could end it. What he has to do is what Joe Biden either couldn't do because he wasn't all there or didn't want to do, and that is pick up the phone and talk to his counterpart, President Putin, and say, NATO is not going to enlarge to Ukraine, and that will end the war.
So you think it's that simple, and that would make peace possible?
It's going to happen, actually. I don't really know why they need 100 days, by the way, but it's going to happen. That one I'm pretty confident about.
Really?
Yes.
That's interesting because when I spoke to Mearsheimer a couple of months ago, he was like, yeah, I don't know, because of the deep state, the foreign policy establishment that's so strong in the United States.
That's correct. What's happening right now is everyone's running up to Trump. You can't do that. You can't do that. We'll lose reputation here. We'll lose reputation there. You must stand strong. We must defend. All the normal reasons for continuing killing Ukrainians, because probably 1 million are dead or seriously wounded by now. Yes, they're trotting out all those arguments, but I don't think Trump's going to listen because Trump basically is, I think, very unlikely to go back to the U.S. Congress and say, I want another $50 billion for Ukraine. I don't see how he could possibly do that. The American people are disgusted by all of this. The budget is without money. We have huge budget deficits. The war makes no sense. People have come to understand that the whole thing was concocted in a crazy kind of way. So I'm pretty optimistic, actually, he's going to end the war.
I would say that that would probably be a positive thing.
Hugely positive.
Okay.
I say let him win 3 Nobel Peace Prizes. I want him to win one for ending the Ukraine war. I want him to recognize the state of Palestine and end the endless wars in the Middle East. And I want him to make an agreement with China. You don't bother us and we won't bother you. And the world will feel a lot safer. So within 1 year, if he does the right thing, the world could be much, much safer than it is right now. And I would hope that the European politicians would stop running around in a tizzy and a panic saying we have to spend 5% of GNP on military, which is crazy. And by the way, Trump is pushing that to sell U.S. weapon systems. Okay, he's a salesman. So I hope that Europeans could calm down, understand the end of the war would be the best thing for European security, rebuild the Nord Stream pipeline, by the way, get the German economy started again, and everybody could calm down a bit.
So this is perfect because this way we can end on a positive note. You say peace is possible. He could shut it down. He could even make the world more peaceful with doing the 3 things that you just said, which would be beautiful. I think most people would be like, yes, please, let us breathe. Let us have a moment of peace. Let us worry about other issues that you have mentioned in our interview. So, Mr. Sachs, thank you so much for entertaining.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for entertaining my questions and explaining your point of view to me and my audience.
Thank you for tolerating me as I did. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.